community too, and preparing for the shows
Well, that's great.
and meeting people I didn't know before who have been active in the community.
Are they
So
recorded?
it's a win-win situation.
Are those shows recorded?
Yes, they are. They're podcasted through the Albert Wisner Library, and they're readily available at any time.
If you're still just joining us, we're waiting just a couple of more minutes. Thank you for your patience. We just expect a few more people to join us today for this program that we're so excited to bring to you from the Warwick Historical Society. And then what else is there to do on a rainy Sunday? Except, I guess,
Right.
our friends down in Florida who are joining us don't have the rainy Sunday that we have here.
We need the water.
We do need it.
That reminds me about accessing this. How can our programs be accessed? These aren't podcasts. Are they actually
No,
podcasts?
they are videotape. She is recording us when we get going, and they are on the YouTube,
YouTube.
on our YouTube channel, and you type in historical Warwick, and then with a capital W and then a capital H, Historical and Society are one word.
Yep.
Historical Society.
Historical Society is
But
one
Warwick
word.
is not.
Warwick and then
Separate.
space and then
Oh,
Historical
I see.
Society.
Okay.
And then you'll see when some of our videos come up, you'll see a big blue W. And that W is what you click on, and all the educational programming comes up on that.
Yep.
Okay. But the History Alive shows that I did with WTBQ are in the library podcast collection.
Yeah,
So
they're in the, if you go to
that's a
local history
local history.
and you go to the database and it's at the bottom of the first column, you'll see all of Doctor's shows.
And
All lined
they
up.
read like the landmark menu. You just go right down the list and
Yeah.
by date and by topic and so forth.
I'm,
Or a la mode, that's nice.
I'm gonna have
Yes,
to
a la
leave.
mode.
I'm gonna have to leave before you're done today because I have a granddaughter picking up some furniture. So please don't think I'm leaving for any other reason.
We
Oh,
understand.
thanks.
Thank you for
Good.
telling
Time
us
with
that.
Yeah.
See, Garrett's back. Hi, Garrett.
Hey, Garrett.
Hello, Garrett. Hi.
We've got Arnold with us too.
Good afternoon. How's everybody?
Hi there. We're great. Thanks.
We're just going to give it one more minute, everybody.
All geared up and ready to go.
And we're about ready to go. As you can see, I am recording this because we want to share this on our YouTube channel. And Ivy was just telling everybody how you can access the other videos. We have a YouTube channel. We've been recording a lot of our programs for the students in the local elementary schools. And they're all uploaded at Warwick space. Historical Society is all one word on YouTube. And then you'll find a purple W, a purple circle with a W in it, and that is our channel. And on there we have many programs that all of the education department, Marianne Knight's education department, Ivy is on there, and Richard and Ivy's last talk is on there as well. And we'll upload this one to that today too.
What we'd like to do as well in the near future is to transfer lectures that I've been given over the last 30 years that are on VHS to other formats, because most people no longer have VCRs in their household, and the one on the historical side doesn't work very well, I've heard. And so we've got all these lectures that I've been given over the years on a variety of topics like the history of agriculture and industry and utopian communities of war in Warwick's history and so forth and so on. And they will eventually be transferred into more accessible formats.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I'm Nora Gurvich, the Executive Director of the Warwick Historical Society, and this is our second program that we've done virtually in 2021. I'm really pleased you could all be here today. A couple of housekeeping things during our Zoom meeting. I'm going to mute you all. If you have access to a computer and you have a question, if you could write that in the chat at the bottom of your screen. If you are calling in and don't have access to a computer now, but have questions for Ivy and Richard, you can email those to me at the Historical Society at your convenience. We will get back to you. So right now, I'm just going to make sure everybody is muted, and that's so that we don't have any feedback. And we are recording this as we were explaining earlier. So thank you again for joining us. And I'd like to introduce Marianne Knight. She is the president of the Warwick Historical Society Board of Directors. And there she is with Richard and Ivy in the great room. So Marianne, all yours.
Nice to see all of you and to be with Dr. Hall and Ivy this afternoon. This is the fourth actually in a series, long interrupted during the COVID, of our programs related to the struggle for civil rights in the US. Today's presentation by Dr. Hall and Ivy is oriented for the Great Migration period. And it will go up to the present day, and it will include a look at the impact that the civil rights had on democracy and the modern day society. A very interesting topic. Thanks for coming today, and I hope you'll really enjoy the presentation by these two distinguished historians. Dr. Hall, the Town of Warwick historian, Ivy, the Village of Warwick historian. Welcome, and thank you for visiting today.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's let
Well-
things roll. We, if you were tuned into us last month, we really, we came up through the period of Reconstruction from approximately the end of the Civil War to 1877. In fact, I think we went a little beyond that, didn't we? We did
Yes,
talk
did.
about,
We've made it
uh,
to the 20s almost.
yeah, the coming into the Jim Crow era. That ran approximately, oh goodness, from the late 1870s right up through 1908, 1910. And some would even argue beyond that. But today we're going to keep moving forward, and I thank, and I know Ivy appreciates the fact that some of you have responded to our previous talks, and Ray Webster is among them. And Ray brought to our attention the role that General President, to become president, Ulysses Grant played. And this book by Ron Chernow on the biography of Grant shows that Grant really was a supporter of the Reconstruction period. And he was a promoter of the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which was a very strong act to prohibit discrimination, segregation in public places. And he was also very supportive of a military post-bellum presence in the southern states to make sure that there would be some sense of law and order and justice and so forth. So Grant needs to be considered an important player in that very crucial period. He became president in 1868 and took this Reconstruction project on in a very forceful and enthusiastic and supportive way.
He certainly did. And he and Andrew Johnson did not get along at all. Grant and Andrew Johnson. And it was really interesting to me to find out that he couldn't stomach slavery at all. And he had been given a gift of a valet, a gentleman to work with him, and he eventually manumitted him because he just couldn't put up with the concept of slavery at all. And his wife came to him with 4 servants, and that wasn't going to fly for him either. So it's something that we didn't know about. And we didn't either know about Woodrow Wilson, who I always think about as the League of Nations. You know, what a wonderful job he did trying to put that together. Did not know myself, not having studied him that thoroughly, that he really was a segregationalist and segregated all of the executive offices. And he was really not for civil rights in the sense that we know it. And of course, the term wasn't familiar to people at that time. They didn't, as Dr. Hull has pointed out to me, that they didn't probably use the term civil rights when we're talking about these guys from the 1800s through the 1920s.
And when the Reconstruction period effectively ended in 1877, many of the progressive constitutions that were being written in the various southern states were repealed, were done away with, and so forth. And there was definitely a serious erosion in the rights of the former slaves, especially in the southern states. And I think that's important to remember too. So the Jim Crow era was an era of voter suppression, I would say. Really, would you?
I feel like
Ivy, I
we're
mean, it-
there again right
Yeah.
now myself. It was an era of voter suppression. It was a separating out of the gifts of the people with brown and black skin, and it was giving them a place separate, which is funny because when you think about the plantations, okay, when the plantation times, the masters wanted the slaves as close, living to them as closely as possible. And then when you get past that time, now they want them pushed away, having their own organizations, settling elsewhere in a small community of their own, away from the white, on the other side of the tracks kind of thing. So yeah, just really very sad situation. And it is, you've heard the term, I'm sure, in the last several months, in particular, systemic racism. Okay, this is totally true. It's so much in our systems that we're having trouble now even seeing it or getting past it. It's only been recently that people are starting to say, wow, where did that come from? Why did I feel like that? Oh, it's strange. And the freedom struggles of the civil rights movement, which we're going to get to talk to a little bit later, laid the foundation for really every other modern rights struggle that we've had, whether you're talking about the LGBTQ communities or our immigrant populations and so on. It's deeply ingrained in our economic DNA as well.
And the acceleration of these voter suppressive policies and actions, particularly in the southern states, led up to the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Supreme Court ruled that, well, there's nothing wrong with segregation. It's not illegal anymore. And as long as you have equal facilities, you can segregate racially if you can, for example, provide a train terminal for the blacks as well, or bathrooms for the public facilities and so forth, that you can engage in segregationist practice. And so it gave this Jim Crow era a sense of legitimacy, the Supreme Court decision. And it also led to a lot of disillusionment among blacks in the South and the beginnings of what we call the Great Migration, the Great American Migration of the 19th century, where tens of thousands of Black men and spouses and families, children as well, moved northward. They had been promised land after the Civil War, and that was not distributed to them. They became virtually sharecroppers, unable to really compete with many white farmers and former plantation owners because they didn't have access to capital. And so they left and they came up into northern cities, and that gravitation accelerated during the First World War because many white men were drafted into service, and there were labor shortages in the North. And so there are economic opportunities. and many of them became workers in factories, wage workers, and in the steel mills, and in a whole variety of endeavors as household domestics. And so we began to see this demographic shift and gaining momentum, as I said, during the period of the First World War, and then slowing down a little bit after that, and then growing again in the period during the Second World War and the post-war World War period. And we'll get into that as well momentarily. But when they moved north, they found there was inadequate housing. And we began to see the ghettoization of these people. And that was another phenomenon that grew out of this great migration. Okay, so I think we can continue to move.
We got a question here, okay? Jim is asking here, why was it allowed to have facilities that were separate but equal when they weren't equal?
They were
Why?
not equal. Well, they were supposed to have been equal, but there was no law enforcement mechanism, effective law enforcement mechanism that was put into place that would assure that equal facilities would be provided
And with
to
states'
the
rights,
population. And states,
you know,
with states' rights, it was
federal
difficult.
government can't go in there, right? And enforce that.
Yeah, I mean, this happened in 1954 with the Supreme Court case, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, which said that these Jim Crow laws were a violation of the 14th Amendment of citizens' rights, but there was they allowed, the Supreme Court allowed the various school boards around the United States and the various states of the United States to implement that, to put it into effect. And many of them did not, of course, especially in the southern states. They did not, it was not enforced. So this is almost a repeat of the problem that was encountered in Plessy versus Ferguson. It was a very strong decision, of course. It was in the Earl Warren days, and it did have a huge effect, and we'll get into that briefly. But you have to have, it's one thing to pass a law, but it's another thing to make sure that people are going to benefit from it and be protected by it. And you need a mechanism. And we have found historically that it's really up to the federal government to ensure that these things are going to happen.
And they didn't employ anybody to do that when they passed these laws. So nobody knew who was in charge of what. And so it just plain didn't work. And, you know, you could have a school for white kids and a school for Black kids, but if the school for white kids has all the brand new textbooks and the other kids get the cast-offs that are 20 years too old to even use anymore, that's separate but equal to other people. Some people thought that was okay.
And
They didn't need the best.
And there had been a reluctance to federalize these things in terms of enforcement and effect. I mean, remember in 1937, the Senate defeated the anti-lynching bill, and actually, it still has not yet been passed. We have not seen Congress. We've not seen the Senate pass an anti-lynching bill, even though lynchings are no longer, fortunately, no longer taking place. But Congress just didn't want to get involved in that, and so it was defeated during the New Deal period.
You know, looking back a little bit on the World War I period, you know, you're up to 1918 and then beyond. There was a Senator, James K. Vardaman, and he said that Black servicemen returning to the South after World War I would inevitably head to disaster because giving a Black man military airs by telling him he had defended his country and giving him a medal and putting a uniform on him would bring him to the conclusion that his political rights must be respected. So when these boys came home in their uniforms, instead of being greeted with grand hurrahs, they were beaten, they were hung, they were shot, they were lynched, they were maimed, and their body parts were hung in store windows.
I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
so some of them probably would have wanted to go back to France.
Yeah, really. Well, then came the Second World War, of course, and again, labor shortages, domestic labor shortages, because so many people were drafted into military service, and that gave new life, new fuel to the demographic shift of people from the South into northern urban areas, into the industrialized North, and so you had another big push of people into the North. There were employment opportunities, good wages, and so forth. So we do see this second phase of this migratory movement. And these people were hardworking, they were intelligent. They in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and 90s, we find them serving as mayors of our major cities like Cleveland, St. Louis, Chicago, New York. And you find a disproportionately large number of those African Americans who became leaders of municipalities from the South. Were part of the migration, some first generation, others second and third generation. But it's really quite a dramatic situation that you found yourself in at that time, that the cities, the whites had fled the cities and blacks were moving in to former white areas. There was a suburban flight to the outer ring. People were getting automobiles they could drive. They're becoming more mobile and could leave. And blacks were coming into the cities in ever larger numbers. And you see it in Orange County, for example, in the city of Newburgh. I mean, the city of Newburgh was overwhelmingly a white city until really the late 1940s and coming into the 50s and 60s. And leadership too. I mean, we know right up until recently, Newburgh City's leadership was predominantly black, had become black. And so the whole demographics, I mean, it increased, unfortunately, it increased the degree of segregation because you found the whites moving out into the suburbs, into the expanding suburbs, and you saw an amalgamation, ethnically speaking. Peoples of Italian ancestry were living in the same block as peoples of German or Greek or Spanish or whatever. You would especially see that in big new cities like Levittown and out on Long Island. But the cities, ironically, were going the other way. The cities, the inner cities, were becoming more segregated racially. The distance between blacks and whites was growing in the cities, and the distance among the whites, various ethnic white groups in the suburbs, they were becoming more heterogeneous. So we began to see that greatly accelerate then in the post-World War II period.
Yeah. One of the things when you think about the development of the cities and the suburbs and so on, one of the articles that I was reading about was talking about the traffic issues that we have in so many of our large cities. And in particular, they were using Atlanta, Georgia as an example of this. And what I found interesting was the governors of those particular, or mayors of those particular cities could decide when a highway was coming through, where this highway was to go. So what they would do is look at the map and they would see where the minority neighborhoods were, where the white neighborhoods were, and they would draw a red line up the map and avoid and cut off so that it was like a barrier or a wall between the African Americans or minorities and the white neighborhoods. So it's not a direct route on the highways that you come on. And we have people who don't want to get on a bus and drive from the suburbs into the city because they didn't want to be on the bus or the train with people who didn't look like them. And so traffic, now you've got traffic unbelievable because they're all taking their cars rather than go to the city by bus. And they also have to take a circuitous route to get to their jobs.
The late 1940s and 50s also saw a movement among Blacks to attempt to desegregate public transportation, to desegregate buses, to desegregate airline, bus terminals, and so forth. And so you begin to see the emergence of a coherent civil rights movement coming into the post-war period. And you saw also prominent people breaking into areas like sports. Jackie Robinson in 1947, of course, was brought into the Major League Baseball. And that was a great turning point. And Jackie Robinson became very popular, not just among African Americans, but among white Americans as well. And there was Billie Holiday, who was a great opponent, of course, of lynching, and wrote a song about it, a critical song. And it got her into jail because they said she's a dangerous woman. She's a terrorist. This is a song that should not be sung in America. And so she had to serve a jail term. And there's a movie that just came out recently on Billie Holiday. It's a wonderful movie. I highly recommend it. So we're beginning to see that. And we're also beginning to see the coming of a more outspoken Black clergy emerging as well. And of course, we all know Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and so forth. And so the civil rights movement, as it began to expand and grow in the 1950s and 60s, was under very strong theological leadership, church pastors, not only from Black churches, but white churches as well. And I think more emphasis needs to be placed on the role that they had, and also on their belief in nonviolent resistance. Many of them, like Martin Luther King, were influenced by people like Gandhi and his concept of satyagraha, exerting soul force, peaceful soul force, in trying to bring about change. And that needs to be examined more thoroughly as well. But we also see the coming of these bus boycotts, as I mentioned. In 1956, the Montgomery bus boycott, and that gave birth to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. And we see the 1954, of course, as I mentioned, Brown versus Board of Education, which overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1894, which added fuel to, as we said, Jim Crow laws. But what it really did, though, was to raise the whole issue of busing too. That if the inner city school is not providing an adequately satisfactory education, then children should be bused out to the suburbs, to what seemingly were better schools, the white schools. And that was a very hot issue coming into the 1960s.
Dr. Jim is just commenting about how he read that in the South, the town was required to build Blacks a school. And it was so nice that the white students moved in and the Black students got the old school. So people were running from each other. I mean, it's
True.
crazy land. And there's a film called 13th, which describes how racism got around the 13th Amendment and by incarcerating blacks at a super high rate and removing their voting rights. So these are all some of the implications of what was impacted.
And we should
during that.
remember what happened in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 too, where the school district there would not allow Black children to enroll in the high school. And Governor Faubus said, that's okay. They can stay in their own Black schools. They shouldn't be coming into the white areas. And Faubus stood at the school door and said, you are not to enter. And I'm going to call out the National Guard if you allow these Black kids into this white school. And Eisenhower, who was president at the time, called out the army and sent the army down there to enforce the legal opportunity for the children to enter that school. And that was a bit of a turning point as well. That was the beginning of the federal government really taking a much more aggressive role in integrating the schools and enforcing the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision, because the local school boards were not enforcing it.
You know, what's interesting to me here is that people are seeing in this time period of the 50s and 60s, they're seeing that there's a problem. They're seeing that there's inequity. They're seeing that there's some injustice there, but they don't see where it's coming from. It's because we're talking about starting in 1619, right? Okay, so this has been, it's like we're nurtured with this slavery for hundreds of years. Now it's in here, and we're looking out there to try to fix and pass a law and change things, but it's in here. Okay, so the education of all people is the most important part of changing racism. Because if you don't realize you have it, you're going to be looking outside and pointing fingers at other people. And this is really it's a heavy burden for all Americans to bear. Because when we enslaved these people, we enslaved ourselves to the beliefs that we created, that we were taught as children. And it is continuing to impact all people of all races on a daily basis here, now in 2021.
Okay, let's move into the 1960s. The 1960s was a very turbulent period, culminating in 1968 with the assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Almost to this day, actually, April 4th,
I think it was
April 4th, 1968, when King was assassinated. And of course, just 3 years earlier, Malcolm X was assassinated as well in 1965 in New York. And this was generating a tremendous amount of tension, of insecurity. But at the same time, this decade would be a decade of rising expectations and a radicalization of the Black empowerment movement. Remember the summer of 1963, the March on Washington, DC, where over 250,000 people, Black and white, people of all backgrounds and beliefs, came forward, and on the steps of Lincoln's memorial, King spoke. And it was an amazing thing. King talked about a dream. He said, you know, we have ideals, but we've got to turn those ideals into reality. And I have a dream. And he inspired and energized people all over the United States, and in fact, all over the world. And this also has to be seen, the American Civil Rights Movement has to be seen within the context of what was happening in Africa too, particularly in South Africa. The rising consciousness of Blacks in South Africa against apartheid,
Apartheid,
racial segregation there. And there was definitely a communication going back and forth. For example, the Montgomery bus boycott that I mentioned in the late 50s was inspired by bus boycotts in South Africa. Again, more emphasis needs to be placed on the communication that was going on between Black civil rights leaders in South Africa and in other parts of Africa as well, and those in the United States. You may know that my own professional field is African history. That's where I was a faculty member at NYU teaching that subject for 49 years. and I was always impressed. And one of my specialties was South African history and apartheid. And I was always struck by the how things were happening in South Africa would, within a matter of months or a year or two, similar situations would occur here in our country, and vice versa. So this was a global thing. This revolution of rising expectations. Africa was being decolonized. The British Empire, the French Empire were collapsing. Independent African nations were emerging, and so forth. So we need to look at that. In 1963, we need to realize that in 1963, Lyndon Baines Johnson became president of the United States after Kennedy's assassination. I mean, this was the era of assassinations, by the way,
Oh,
as
yeah.
well. That needs to be studied more thoroughly too. Was that just a coincidence that so many important leaders were being assassinated in the 60s, or was this beyond that? Anyway, he would establish what came to be called the Great Society. And Johnson was in the White House from 1963 to 1969. And that's when a lot of civil rights legislation was being passed. Part of his Great Society program, part of his affirmative action program, that was he who established the Office of Equal Employment Opportunity, making sure that there would be no discrimination, job discrimination. And that became a very important office. Many Blacks came into positions, leadership positions, in various departments of the United States government in Washington. And Washington itself, the Washington, D.C. Leadership was, Black leadership was beginning to move upward and forward. But at the same time, the period from 1964 onwards saw a lot of urban unrest in Harlem, in Watts, in Los Angeles, in Newark, the riots in Newark, the riots in Detroit,
Yeah, Selma to Montgomery marches.
Selma marches, the rise of the Black Panther movement, and as I mentioned, the Black Muslim movement as well, being led by Malcolm X through his right up into his assassination, but also the passage of a lot of civil rights legislation. 1964 came the Civil Rights Act, which was really a revival of the 1875 Civil Rights Act that President Grant had signed. Amazing. And a realization by 1963-64 that act was not being enforced and needed to be stronger. So a new Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed by Congress. And this provided protection of people's voting rights. The Civil Rights Act tried to prohibit workplace discrimination on the basis of race. That was the major intention of that. The major intention of the Voting Rights Act a year later was to protect people's right to vote. And that led to the beginnings of a massive enfranchisement of the African-American population in our country. That's when you began to really see some teeth being put into the protection of voters and to encourage African-Americans to go to the polls and vote. So then people began to take African Americans seriously. Politicians began to take them seriously. The Republican and Democratic Party began to make every effort, especially the Democratic Party, to ensure that African Americans would have some a political voice in our democracy.
And if they
as
did, then
well.
they were the vote that you wanted to court.
Yeah,
So-
exactly, you see.
That's when they
And
pay
so-
attention to it.
So that was those two acts, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, were very important and contributed to this revolution of rising expectations. But also we have to consider the 1968 Fair Housing Act. And we have to consider it right now because
Yeah.
sadly, Ramsey Clark just passed away at the age of 93 yesterday. Ramsey Clark was the Attorney General during the Johnson administration in Washington. And Ramsey Clark was one of the key attorneys in drafting civil rights legislation. Almost all the credit for the passage of the Housing Rights Act, Fair Housing Rights Act of 1968. Much of that credit must go to Ramsey Clark.
This is the anniversary,
he
you
was-
know, April 11th.
April 11th, my
Yeah.
golly, that's true. You're absolutely right. And that Fair Housing Act was a very important act because coming into 1968, Blacks were having a very difficult time trying to put a roof over their heads and trying to raise their families. And so really we must honor Ramsey Clark. He was, of course, the son of a distinguished Supreme Court justice too, and a brilliant lawyer, and one of the greatest promoters of civil rights in our country. And he just passed the other day.
Jim is recommending a book for those of you who are interested. It's called Stamped from the Beginning by Abram X. Kendi. So if you're interested in doing some more reading, that's a good book for you to go check out.
Very good. 1968 brought more riots, though. Riots in over 100 American cities. Over 700 people were killed. Over 2,600 people were injured. Over 21,000 people were arrested, mainly African Americans. There were shootouts in the streets everywhere. It looked like everything was coming apart. So it's so ironic that as African Americans were given more civil rights, more violence occurred, and a lot of that violence was stimulated by whites who felt that their dominant position in America was going to be increasingly challenged by this rising civil rights movement.
Yeah,
And,
not that they were going to be getting help from very intelligent people to do everything they wanted to accomplish, but rather they were being threatened. And that, of course, that in our day shouldn't really make sense to us, but it did in the 60s and 70s.
And then we had that wonderful book by Otto Kerner, who was the governor of Illinois, I believe, Ivy, and he wrote a book saying this grew out of the Kerner Commission report on race relations and so forth. And Kerner's book said, we are moving toward apartheid in this country. We are moving toward two countries. Blacks and whites are not coming closer together. They're moving further apart geographically and in other ways as well. And everywhere, though, municipalities were forming human rights commission. Jim Daniels here in Warwick in 1968 got the Warwick Town Board to set up a commission on human relations. And many other prominent Black Americans in Warwick, a large number of them employees of the reformatory here, the Reform School. When the Reform School in Warwick was established in the 1930s by the state of New York, they hired many recent social worker graduates, Black social worker graduates. They came up to Warwick. They provided the staff of the reformatory, and they became involved in Warwick. And they ensured that some of the best Black juvenile delinquents in the institution were allowed to enroll in Warwick High School. Some of the best minds in Warwick High School And best athletes in Warwick High School were young Black youths who were living down in the reformatory down the street on Kings Highway. So that had an effect. But what came along though in the 1970s, the decade of the 70s, was drugs. Drugs began to proliferate. This is the era of permissiveness in terms of drugs. And Nixon in 1971 declared a war on drugs. And then Rockefeller, governor of New York in 1973, joined in, and he launched a war on drugs in the state of New York. And the state legislature passed draconian legislation requiring a mandatory 15-year penalty for anyone caught distributing drugs or using drugs in the open. Marijuana, heroin, cocaine, and so forth would be put in the slammer. And that's when we saw this tremendous growth in incarceration in our country. The prisons were filling up, new prisons needed to be built, old ones needed to be expanded. Our reformatory here in Warwick was jammed with African Americans and Hispanic youths. If someone wanted to do research on African Americans in Warwick, let us say as recently as 2010, of the 628 inmates in the reformatory here in Warwick, out of 628, 553 were African Americans and Hispanics. There are more Black people living in Warwick in the prison than outside the prison in our community.
They would be put in jail for loitering, for meeting up with a group of friends after supper, for things like this, that having small amounts of personal use marijuana. And the African Americans who were caught like this ended up with, some of them much longer than 15 years.
Oh, yeah.
Some people ended up in the South, ended up in life sentences. And what we have then is a repetition of the plantation system is mirrored in these places, these prisons and these reform schools and so on, that we're putting up as fast as we can get them up so we can get all these people put away from us.
Between 1971 and 1986, the incarceration rate in the United States grew by 80%. It was and a disproportionately large number of those being in prison were African Americans, and of youths as well as middle-aged African Americans. And drug trafficking was growing everywhere. Isn't that ironic that now the New York State Legislature just legalized marijuana, and 30 or 40 years ago, you go to jail if you use marijuana for any purpose, medical or otherwise. So we have come a long way on that. And of course, as you know, our reformatory, which later morphed into the Mid-Orange Correctional Facility, closed its doors in 2011. And now we have that beautiful Wickham Woodlands Park, thanks to the town of Warwick board. And we have a technology park now too. And in that technology park, that park is going to be a center of cannabis production. I mean, it's amazing how history turns that way. It's just incredible. But by 1980, 500,000 people were in prison for drug law violations. And by 2012, 2 million were being incarcerated for abuse of drugs, going from 500,000 to 2 million between 1980 and 1912.
It's just a mind-blowing thing to think about. And, you know, when you look at what the results of slavery have been for us all, from 1619 now to the present day, Wall Street, okay, the setup of Wall Street has to, oh, good, thank you. It has to do with slavery. Slavery impacted that. The economic growth we had from slavery, from the work of the backs of others, really developed Wall Street. It's affected industry. And if you've worked ever for a large company, the plantation system is what taught people, first of all, that it started them keeping ledgers and doing accounting books and so on. That started at the plantation level. The way it was run, with the way the plantations were run, where there had to be constant output. You ever worked for IBM or any of those big companies, you know that you have to put out or they don't have any interest in you. That comes from the plantation system and from slavery. The constant looking at people when they're working. Now, all the technology to see how many mouse clicks they do in a day, what one of your employees is doing, or how many places they visited online during that day, and did that have anything to do with what their business is. So this constant checking on people comes from that's the slavery era. Housing is affected because of what we talked about, the redlining and how people didn't, once they built those highways and so on, people didn't put money into any neighborhood that had been redlined because it was, not something that was worth anything to them. So housing doesn't improve for those people. Our traffic system, like I said, this is all on account of slavery. Medical care, massively impacted. This during the whole COVID issue here. There are still textbooks that are teaching doctors that African Americans feel less pain, they have a higher pain threshold than whites, that their skin is thicker and more resilient than whites. And so if you're going in for surgery, you're not going to get the opiates that the white guy is going to get to keep you from, having a terrible time during your recovery. You're not going to be willing to go out. We had the Tuskegee experiments where they were taking young men who had syphilis, and the doctors, they thought they were in a hospital and they were going to be cured. The doctors were just watching them and experimenting on them so that they could learn about the disease. They never told the families that they didn't treat them. So now these guys are going, injections? No. And that's why we're having trouble now trying to make sure that our Black and brown skin population trusts us enough to come get the inoculations so that this doesn't spread. And they're dying. They're dying faster than any of us because they don't have the stamina, because in some neighborhoods, they're not being fed emotionally, spiritually, physically, and because they don't trust that we have their best interests at heart. And again, the prison system's set up that way. So, this backfired on us, white guys. It really did, because we are affected directly by what we created in the system.
But we have made a lot of progress though in the last 25 or 30 years. We really have. I mean, you look at Orange County, what has happened right here in our own county. I don't know if you remember Harvey Berger. Harvey Berger, an African-American from Newburgh, was the first Black to be elected to our Orange County legislature in 1998. He was to be joined by Noel Spencer, another African-American, a very successful accountant, has his own business here in Orange County, was elected to the Chester Town Board, and then eventually became a county legislator in 1998. No, he was elected. He was appointed in 1998 and elected to fill a vacancy, and then elected in 2003. We had Jim Moss, who was appointed managing editor-in-chief of the Times Herald Record by the Ottaway family, who own the Times Herald Record. And he served as the top guy on the record for a number of years in the 1990s, and then went on to Newburgh and started his own business, and unfortunately, a few years ago, passed away. We had Ramon Betancourt, in 2010, was sworn in as Orange County's first Black police chief in the city of Middletown. We have Kevin Barrett, who became Newburgh's official city historian in the late 1990s. We had people like Beverly Braxton, who was winning awards for distinguished teaching and community service here in our Warwick Public School system and across Orange County. We had the Robinsons, Mr. and Mrs. Robinson. George Robinson became a trustee of the Reformed Church here in Warwick, was also a prominent social worker, and his wife was a prominent educator in our school system in that period. We had just so many. Hugh Marius of Sugarloaf, another African American who went on and became commissioner of the New York State Liquor Authority, a very powerful position that had huge responsibility. He lived in Sugarloaf. I could go on for another 15 or 20 minutes. But that period from the 1980s, early 80s through the 90s was a period where many African Americans were moving into positions of real leadership and responsibility, not only in our own town. Some of you may remember Wilbur Anderson, who was on our school board. Wilbur was a moving force on our school board. I don't think we have any African Americans on our school board today.
No.
Maybe we do, but I can't
To my knowledge.
think of any. We had so many, and yet that momentum began to weaken as we came into the 21st century. And when I was doing research on this doing it for the last 2 years now, trying to update my files, and I would make phone calls. Oh no, unfortunately, he passed away 2 years ago, or unfortunately, she's in a nursing home now, and I would say to myself, well, who's filling their shoes now? Who's taking their place in these positions? How many African Americans do we have in our county legislature? I don't think we have a single one. How many do we have in our town board? How many do we have? How many mayors or supervisors do we have in Orange County that are of African ancestry? We have lost momentum. And now we're seeing the emergence of voter suppression again as well. This whole idea of white supremacy. We have to maintain our values and our democracy, and we have to tighten up our voter regulations in the name of democracy, in the name of maintaining voter integrity. But actually, many of the laws that are currently being passed or under consideration by legislatures across America, over 350 bills are now under consideration in 43 states in our country, bills that will make it more difficult for African Americans to exercise their constitutional right.
Yeah, I
to
just
vote.
got one note
And
here that
that's a worry too.
we only have one person of color on the board, and it's a Latina woman.
A Latina.
Yeah. And so that's interesting.
So we
have more
we
than
do have a few. Now there's Samantha Knowles, for example. She is from a Black family from Florida Village, and Samantha Knowles graduated from Dartmouth just a few years ago, and she put together a documentary. What was it called? The Blue Line.
Yeah.
It had to do with relations of the police department and African Americans. And of course, that is somewhat of an outgrowth of this new movement called Black Lives Matter. And the recent trial that's going on right now with Rodney, drawing a blank now. I've been watching it. What's his name? Floyd George.
George
Uh,
Floyd, yeah.
Yeah, George.
Floyd's
Yeah.
murderer.
And, that case is being watched by millions of Americans. It'll be very interesting to see how we react to that, how blacks as well as whites are going to react
It's a
to the
hallmark
outcome.
case.
It's a hallmark case.
It really
It's a
is.
hallmark case.
We've
Um,
never seen police officers testify against each other. It's the
Yeah.
first time we've ever seen that happen. So I have a lot of hope that this is going to go through and people are going to get what they deserve justice-wise this time. And maybe we're moving in the right direction right now. Garrett was remarking that the prison system, and it was kind of an extension of Jim Crow. And it's really systemic racism at its best, or most obvious, I think you could say. Susan is recommending that we read Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And I did some research on some of Brian Stevenson's writings. And he said that slavery gave America a fear of Black people and a taste for violent punishment. And both still define our criminal justice systems to this day. All right, we got a time of 3 o'clock. Good. Okay. So we
Okay.
have 15 more minutes to talk about anything else we want to talk about, and then we want to do some live questions with our team here.
I think the attack on our capital too, the riot of January 6th of this year needs to be seen within the context of race relations, of Black empowerment, of certain members of our community believing that that our democracy is in danger, that Black supremacy or white supremacy needs to be upheld. And that word white supremacy worries me because I lived for quite a while in South Africa, off and on, lecturing and doing research there and writing books about apartheid in South Africa. And I worry that we are entering a period now where there could be a great deal of frustration, anger, and increase in violence. And that's why I think we are having this program. I see our shows here as hopefully as a community outreach to get conversation going among all of us here in Warwick and beyond about issues of civil rights and equality. And I think that hopefully we will be able to continue this as well. In my own case, I started this back in 2010. My first lecture here in Warwick was a history of African Americans. And then on my History Alive radio show on TBQ, 15 of those shows were interviews with Black Americans living throughout Orange County, trying to get feedback from them. And then Ivy, fortunately, and the Historical Society was able to come in and join me. And so we've been doing things together now since, when was our first?
Oh, we've done
it was,
several radio programs in
Yeah,
addition to.
we've done a number of radio shows where,
1619 was where you started us off with that history of the bringing of the slaves for the first time here. And you were kind enough to let me jump in and make a few comments there, which was fun.
it was, I enjoyed it too. So we have become a team, and I hope that team is going to grow, that more of you will get involved. That particular series began in October of 2019 when we opened up the former AME Black Church. As you know, the Historical Society, they were going to demolish that church to build a new one on McEwen Street. And members of the society and in the wider community got together, and companies like Orange and Rockland providing free service to move that church across the village over to Forrester Avenue. And it was given to the Warwick Historical Society. We restored the building and we had a kind of grand opening there. And in October of 2019, I gave a talk on on the 1619 project and the history of the transatlantic slave trade, which was one of my fields of specialty. And it brought an amazing audience. We had a standing room only audience. And I was so delighted to see so many African Americans. You were there, I think, Ivy,
Yes, it
weren't you?
was. Mhm.
I mean, it was really a wonderful audience and very good communication. There's no anger expressed or anything. I mean,
Yeah,
it
it's great.
really went very, very well. And I did that because I was so impressed by the fact that the New York Times devoted an entire insert in one of their Sunday papers in August of 2019 on the so-called 1619 project to mark 400 years since the coming of first slaves being brought from Africa to what would become the United States. Actually, it went back further than that, though. 1619 is okay. It's kind of a convenient date, but actually slaves are being brought into what would become America, into what would become the state of Florida as far back
Right,
as the
Spanish colonies.
1570s.
Mhm.
In fact, by 1619, by Jamestown, there were already thousands of African Americans in North America and what would become the United States. They mainly were transshipped from Jamaica and from Mexico to Florida, to Fort Lauderdale and a few other areas in Florida. So we really even go back more than 400 years in terms of African American growth and development and suppression in what has become the United States of America.
Garrett's remarking here that he'd be curious to know, and actually I would be too, what Justice John Roberts thinks of all the onerous voting rights bills in reaction to the big lie made possible by getting the Voting Rights Act from his court in 2013. I wonder if he saw what came at us this last year.
I wonder,
If
what
he-
do you think, Ivy? I don't know if I can answer that question.
I have a sense that Roberts was a little bit more mellow than people thought he was, at least recently. He was a little bit of a hard guy earlier on, but that's a question that I'd love to actually interview him with and say, what do you see happening here? Because
Well, one of the big questions is, should the enforcement of civil rights occur at the federal level or at the state level
yeah,
first? And I think this is one of the problems. I have found myself as an historian looking back over the breadth of history that the most successful movements along the road to civil rights have been initiated at the federal level, and the enforcement as well. Because when you leave it up to individual states, I mean, on the one hand, I believe in a certain amount of states' rights and as much power being devolved more widely across our country in terms of political legislative institutions. I do feel that is very important for our federal government to make sure that that all citizens in America, whether they live in South Carolina or Oregon or New York or wherever, they all enjoy the same protection. They all can look to our United States Constitution. And that's what was so worrisome about that attack on our Capitol, on the Senate and the House of Representatives in January 6th of this year, that that a provision of our U.S. Constitution was being honored and affected there through the through the election inauguration, ultimately, of a new president, the transfer of authority from one administration to another. And the people who attacked the Capitol were going against that. We're going against it. And yet they were going against it in the name of the American flag and patriotism. But I think they were going against it also because they didn't fully understand the Constitution. And that gets us back to something that I've been calling for years as an educator, and that is we need to return to civics as part of our curriculum in our public schools. We need our young people to know
Totally.
something about our Constitution, not just our state constitution, our federal
Federal
constitution
Constitution.
as well. And most Americans really don't understand it. And that impressed me most when and some of you have heard me say this before, and I'm sorry I have to repeat myself, but I feel it's necessary. One day I asked a class, I had about 60 students in it, how many of you know anything about the 13th and 14th Amendments and the Bill of Rights? And 3 hands went up. And they were the hands not of American-born US citizens. They're the hands of 3 people who had recently become US citizens, naturalized citizens. And that's because they had to take a course. To become a US citizen, you have to take an exam and you have to study American history. And they knew our Constitution. And here are all the other almost 60 students in my class. They couldn't tell me anything about the Bill of Rights, the amendments and so forth. And that is shocking. Now, I can say though, that in the Warwick Valley School District, I think some of our faculty at the high school and even the middle school are doing a pretty good job, better than in many of the school districts around Orange County, because I've been looking at them. And so we're making progress, but we need to make a lot more. But in many of the school districts around here, civics is no longer, well, actually civics is no longer taught in Warwick either. That's been
Yeah,
abandoned.
it goes,
but,
there's some there, but it goes by a different name.
Well, it goes by a
S-
different
yeah.
name. But I think to the credit of the Warwick Historical Society, the Warwick Historical Society has an education committee that has reached out to our public schools, to all of our public schools, not just the high school. And they've been working with faculty on areas of curriculum. But really much more needs to be done. And until that's done, I'm afraid we are going to see more incidents like that at the Capitol on January 6th of this year.
I
Oh.
have an interesting quote from Nicole Hannah Jones, who was part of the 1619 project. And she says, our founding ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans fought to make them true. And without this struggle, America would have no democracy at all. And I think I really agree with that. Because without their courage and without all of this hard work and without the blood that has been shed, which they did not hurt anyone, but the blood that the killings, the murders, the lynching, and they still stand up. They still try. Yet we would not really be thinking about what democracy really means.
But I also think we need to understand that the civil rights movement would never have been as successful as it has been so far. And I think overall it's been quite successful without whites and blacks cooperating and working together. And it gets back to people like Ramsey Clark. Ramsey Clark was just one of the great champions of the civil rights movement. And so we have to understand that too. I mean, it's because if we don't, and if that doesn't become part of our curriculum, there will be this idea that, all whites are really bad. All whites exploit blacks, and they have been the total cause of our misery. And that just isn't true.
It's not true.
And so I think that more emphasis needs to be placed on the good things that have come out of this movement, the good things, the positive things, and the fact that it's been the work of Jews, of Christians, of blacks, of whites, of Africans, of Americans, working together synergistically.
Central Americans,
Central
South
Americans.
Americans.
And we
Canadians.
need to and we need to balance our growing nationalism with globalism, with internationalism.
So we're at time right now, but I wanted to just wonder what you think of an idea that requires all voters to pass a civics test similar to that which we force our naturalizing citizens to take.
I definitely think that should be the case.
Yeah.
And I also definitely believe that there should be a period of national service of a year, 2 years.
Many
every-
countries do it.
For every young American should serve this country, similar to, I guess, during the New Deal period, like the Civilian
Mhm.
Conservation
Conservation
Corps and
Corps
so
and the
forth.
artists
We
program and-
need to go back to that. We really do. But it needs to be done in a very fair way, of course. But I am a believer in some sort of national service for all people who want to be American, aspire to be American citizens.
Yeah, and if you're not, she shouldn't be voting until you've taken that test, whether you're were born here or not. You need to understand what voting is about, what it's for, why it's important, why that single vote is such a
Yeah.
big deal.
Yeah.
Nora, can you unmute our guests so that if any of them have further comments or questions, we can talk with
If
them?
you cannot unmute yourself, if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll be happy to unmute you, or you can type your questions into chat if you cannot unmute yourself, and I'll be happy to read those. But does anybody have any questions?
And by the way, we encourage critical examination of all the material that we've been discussing today. If you have suggestions, disagreements, agreements, or whatever, please come forward. That's why I appreciated so much
what Ray did for us this
Ray
week.
Webster sent us a memo and said, hey, wait a minute, what about Grant? Wait a minute, what about Wilson? Wait a minute, why don't you discuss this or that? And I welcome that. I relish it. And I know Ivy does too. So, I
It's
mean,
always nice to learn something
We
new.
have a couple comments for you, couple of questions. Gerard wants to know, how about the children of all elected officials subject to the draft and the front lines as an incentive to put off wars?
Yeah.
there you go. Yes. How about that? That definitely needs to be seriously discussed.
Susan
Yes.
and Marcia say thank you so much, and this was fascinating. And Garrett says thank you so much to Dick and Ivy for the wonderful and important discussion. This was.
I have a question or a brief
Please.
comment. I
Hi,
haven't
Howard.
been on the image. Hello. Thank you for the conversation. There was a remarkable story that is not that well known regarding Hilburn. In the late 1940s, before Brown versus Board of Education, there was an effort that was successful to basically shut down the two segregated schools in Hilburn, New York. And Thurgood Marshall, as a young lawyer, came out and contributed to that effort. At the
Really?
time, there was a brick, well-built school for the white students and a shack basically for the non-white students that would include not only blacks, but also Ramapo Indians. And
Fascinating.
it's an interesting local story that was actually quite significant that was desegregated.
Thank you, Howard. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, he was quite something, Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah, he was. A product, incidentally, of historically black college too, that grew out of the Reconstruction period. That's where I say, we need to look at the positives as well as the negatives. And we need to not place so much emphasis on victimization, on victims and perpetrators. We need to place more emphasis on leadership, on the positive achievements that people have made to advancing the civil rights of all of us, and in the fields of law and medicine and education, and that needs to be said too, I think.
I
Not-
think we're
not
coming
just
to that
victimization
point,
and
where
perpetration.
we're starting to see where we went wrong. We're starting to see the wonderful gifts that all of our citizens have to give us. And I'm feeling, as the weeks have gone by and as I've been watching the trial and so on, I've just been feeling a lot more comforted by the fact that people are starting to recognize, they're starting to question the way we've always thought of things, the way we've always done things. And they're starting to take good hard looks at themselves. And I think we're well on our way. I mean, I have experienced over the last, I want to say last year, having watched a lot of news because we're stuck home and, you know, you want to know what's going on out there. I've been very impressed by the people, both Black and brown skin folks and white reporters who are really opening their minds and really speaking clearly about what's important, about who is an American and what we can all do for each other. And so I have a lot of faith in this country. I know we have a lot to work against here, but I think we're going to finally maybe get there in the next year or two. I would really hope.
And overall, I think over the last 25 or 30 years, we have made progress. It makes me think, always reminds me of an African-American woman who lived here in Warwick for many years. She was a graduate of NYU and very bright. And she was coming out to Warwick one very hot day in the middle of the summer. This was about 45 years ago. And she stopped off at a diner here in Warwick on Oakland Avenue, getting off the bus. And she was feeling very dehydrated, getting dizzy. She walked in and asked if she could have a drink of water. And she was denied that. And I think that, you know, and I've heard over the years studying Warwick's history, people relating to me incidents of just gross racism and racial discrimination.
How difficult it was for
And,
them here. But then there
yeah.
was also, there's a history of people who worked so hard, and how they managed it, I don't know, but they were able to buy property. And they were voting and they were paying taxes and these were people in our African-American community here in Warwick and back in the 1800s. So we have records of that going on here as well. And there were freedmen here who were incredible artisans during the time of the colonial period and in the 1860s and such. Were really, there was a representation and people don't realize that it's all part of our history too.
There is a much loved Black pastor of the Bellevale
yeah.
Methodist Church going back to the 1830s,
Yep.
who had a wonderful influence on Warwick in those days, very influential. So, you know, we've come a long way, but I think we're making progress. But often it seems like for every 2 steps forward, we have to take a step. One takes a step backward again. And it's almost cyclical. I mean, you look at, I mean, here we have even now these civil rights acts. I worry about that because those are acts, that's legislation that can be overturned by Congress. Some of those,
Or the Supreme Court,
some,
or
yeah, some of the principles in that
the
should be
state
built into
governments.
our Constitution, should be part of our Constitution.
I have-
Not just legislative acts that can be overthrown very quickly with changing politics and so forth.
Nora.
I just have a couple of more comments for you, Ivy and Richard. Arnold says, very enlightening, thank you. And then Gerard says, the history of the European white and dominating the
Thank you.
Latino, the indigenous peoples, the Blacks, nations in this country is still attenuated, but still present paradigm. And the Underground Railroad and the Klan existed here at the same time.
Yeah, and we're not done yet with that because we have other groups that are doing the work that the Klan did
Yeah,
many years ago.
yeah.
And we all recognize that it's here. But we have to continue to work and do what we need to do in order to educate the community.
Well,
about what we need.
And
wanna- Go ahead,
before we conclude, I like to thank Nora Gervich, the executive director, for all she's doing here in the Warwick Historical Society.
Yay! We haven't been
Real
doing so
applause for
well
her
in years.
And for her husband, Mike,
Oh,
who we wouldn't be doing this right now if it weren't for Mike and
All the
setting this
techie
whole thing up,
knowledge.
this high tech here. And thirdly, Marianne Knight, who is the
Oh, you're so
president of the
kind.
board of the
Comes out on a
Historical
Sunday.
Society as well, and comes out on a Sunday, rainy Sunday afternoon to welcome us. And
Well, I think I
And-
could speak for all of us here today and say thank you to Dr. Hall and to Ivy for the fabulous work that they do all the time, not just for these presentations, but for their information that they bring forward. I'm always fascinated by the spot that we end at, and I felt us ending today, that the secrets were education and service. Those two things come up time and time again
they do.
as solutions to the problems that we've faced, not just now, but over the years. So thank you all so much for coming today.
Yeah.
Thank you to our
Yes.
two presenters.
Thanks for
you,
making
today.
this fun
everybody.
for us.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
we
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.